Welcome to Happy Talks with Dr. Alice and Donovan. Dr. Alice Fong is a holistic naturopathic doctor and founder of Amor de Soi Wellness, and Donovan Jensen is a software engineer and founder of HowToHappy.com. Together, they're out to cause more happiness in the world.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Happy Talks. My name is Dr. Alice, and this is my awesome co-host, Donovan. And today we are talking about perfectionism. Perfectionism, yes. I don't know if we can all relate to that. I know some people can be a little more perfectionist than others. But yeah, Donovan, what are your initial thoughts when it comes to this topic?
Yeah, I do think perfectionism or being a perfectionist is fairly common.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think for most people, it is more likely in certain realms of life than others, which is to say that for each individual, there are usually a handful of things that people tend to be perfectionists around.
Yeah.
Obviously, like you said, it's not 100% true for everyone,
Mm-hmm.
but people tend to have like certain things that they really, really want to perform well at. And, I think it comes out of, or at least here's a starting hypothesis, and we can dig around this, which is I feel like in school, right? You start going to school and you're taught to take tests, right? And, or, submit papers or whatever else. And those are graded on an objective scale. So they're saying either, you got this right or you got this wrong. And I feel like from a very early time, you're taught sort of you can do things right or wrong, or there are objectively correct answers or not.
Mm-hmm.
And then as you sort of move out of school into the real world where things are a lot messier, then you end up, or a lot of people end up carrying this mindset with them and sort of thinking like, oh, there's an objectively correct way to do this. There's 100% A+ way to sort of do this particular thing. And a lot of people also get that pressure from sort of grades that they want to continue and move forward this sort of idea of like, oh, I want to do this perfectly. And it's just not necessarily a useful or realistic way to sort of think about things, but I will just start the conversation there and see what you think about that hypothesis.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great hypothesis. And it really makes sense because it is hammered into us to perform, but it's actually very straightforward and linear. It's like, okay, you're given what you should study generally, hopefully, and you get a certain number of answers correct on the test, and you strive to get as many right as you possibly can. Even though I wasn't like always a straight A, sometimes I would get straight A's, but it would be like sometimes A's and B's, sometimes a C once in a while. One time I had to drop out of a class because I wasn't doing well enough. That has happened. And I realized that it has impacted my self-worth because I had just focused so highly on like my worth in this class or this program is dependent on my GPA. And so therefore, if I don't strive for the 4.0, then, I suck. And so, but it's so different when you're out of school in a different context, because there's not like a set, like maybe for some protocols, maybe for some work careers and jobs, maybe it's very clear and outlined, but for maybe a lot of life and a lot of projects, there's not like A, B, C, D, and then do this correctly, perfectly. And there's so much subjectivity to things. It's like, how can you even decide if it's perfect? And so then you're constantly trying to perfect something that almost is impossible to perfect. And that can probably cause some mental health issues.
Yeah. I think just adding on to that, people who tend to be perfectionists seem to be very stressed out all the time, right? Because it's not realistic to try to push towards being perfect all the time at everything. And another thing that kind of layers into that from the school stuff is, in general, in school, if you mess up on a test or something, you are not given an opportunity to sort of correct for that or learn or improve and then re-demonstrate your skill. Now, every once in a while, some classes are set up like that and whatnot, but in general, that is not the case. Typically, it is one and done. You have one shot to sort of do this right. And when you think about things in general life, that's usually not the case. So I'll give you an example. There are people who want to sort of get a job at the same place that I'm at, right?
Exactly.
And there is a certain period of time that you have to wait between interviewing, which
Mhm.
I think is 6 months. I don't know. It doesn't really matter.
Mhm.
But the most practical way to think about it is to, every time you have an opportunity, if that's what you want to do, you want to work there, you want to have this particular job, apply, see how you do. It's harder than you might think to get feedback. So we'll skip that step. But generally, you'd want to get feedback or figure out, where you're sort of missing some points, and then at another point in the future, try again. But everyone I've ever talked to about this topic always has this idea of like, okay, I have this one shot.
Mhm.
How do I make sure that I figure it out on the first try? But if you talk to people who actually did it, many of them took multiple tries and had multiple sets of interviews at separate times before they actually were able to get through it. And that maps much more closely to everything in real life, as opposed to this
Right.
idea is just sort of, you have one opportunity, and if you don't do it correctly the first time, you're not going to get it. Now, I think I mentioned a couple times in the past, every once in a while that is true. Every once in a while you do really only have one chance.
Yeah.
But generally that's not true.
No, I agree, and I've adapted and learned through just life experiences that, yeah, maybe if you suck at an interview, you've gotten something out of it. Maybe you don't get the job, but maybe you've learned to make better eye contact or be more present and really try to connect with the interviewer a little better, or you pick up something that you can take into the next interview, and it gets easier with practice and time. And it's like you almost have to realize that you have to, and we've touched on this topic before in other episodes, that we have to be willing to suck to get better at things. It's like we can't just be perfect right off the get-go. It's very rare for any individual to be perfect at everything all the time. It's not really realistic. And I just thought of like one of my own job interviews for like one of like the first doctor jobs that I did not get. I completely bombed it, where there were probably like 10 doctors in the room interviewing me for that, which is intimidating enough. And I completely froze. And I just remembered, I don't know if this really relates to the topic, but I just remembered just like flashback of one question I remember from that interview was like, name a time when you were uncomfortable or something, something to that effect. And I was like, right now, I'm super uncomfortable because I absolutely bombed that interview. And, now I've kind of, it's not like, oh, if I don't get this job, I will never work a day ever in my life. That's not going to happen. I've had so many jobs since then, and I've gotten better at interviewing. I've built up my work experience. So I'm very desirable for people now, hopefully. But it took time. It took practice, and it took a lot of, fuck ups, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the way you're talking about it now is sort of the more healthy and useful way to
Yeah.
approach these
Mhm.
things. But when you subscribe to something like perfectionism, like a lot of the time, there's the belief systems that go along with that are,
Mhm.
if you mess up that one interview, right,
Yeah.
then you should just give up. Like I have heard recently in my life from people
Mhm.
times where they were interviewing for something.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we'll stick with that example. Specifically interviewing for something, did it one time, it did not go well,
Right.
and have sort of written off that path for themselves. And while we didn't have a conversation explicitly around perfectionism, I would have to say I think that's likely at play here, because it's only one shot, right? Like you've only made one attempt.
Yeah.
And in that same vein, anytime that you are trying to do something like you talked about just now, and we've talked about in the past,
Mhm.
there's a very, very high chance that you will have to go through a period of not being super awesome at it or whatever else.
Yeah.
Unlike school, where, a lot of times you could study hard enough to be able to remember enough of the material to pass the test, because hypothetically the tests are written in a way
Mhm.
that you can do that. But
Mhm.
life is not necessarily set up in a way that on your first attempt with little or no experience, you're going to be able to pass whatever the bar is for that specific thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I would be curious, one of the things I notice about people with perfectionism, and, I would say I'm guilty of it sometimes, but I think what I've noticed in my patients or just even friends that have a higher perfectionist tendency, like AKA my husband, for one, I think it really stems from, I want to get the job done and I want to get it done well, but it doesn't have to be like 199.9% like dot my I's, cross my T's, like everything. And it drives me crazy because it's like, because has that tendency, it just makes the process so much slower. And I want to get things done and I like to do things faster. So we have that kind of um difference in our personalities. But I think part of that comes from like maybe his childhood stuff, and he deals with anxiety, and I think that's very common for a lot of people who have that tendency. It comes from anxiety of feeling like they're not worthy or they're not enough if they don't get it right. I'm all about like get the job done, but I don't have to like go to the extreme because I don't think that's very realistic. But then if you compared me to someone I view as like super lax, you know, then maybe to them I might be seeing like, because I'm like, oh well, I want to get the job done completely. To someone else that might seem like I am a perfectionist because I'm trying to do all the things that I need to do. So maybe it's all relative.
Yeah, the way that I think about it is it's sort of like a spectrum or a range, right? And
Yeah.
on one side of the spectrum, you have sort of this like perfectionism, and towards the extreme end of that, you have people who won't complete something or refuse to turn something in because they're spending so much time trying to rewrite one sentence out of a 7,000-page book and spending 6 months trying to do that, right? Like that's on one extreme end where they want every single detail to be 100% perfect. And then on the other end, you just sort of have I don't know what else to call it, besides just like doing a shitty job, right? Like
Right,
just doing
exactly.
the absolute bare minimum,
Yeah.
where the quality is definitely suffering.
Yeah.
So I think there is something to be said for sort of adjusting your dial, and there's probably some amount of personal preference that goes into it that's a little bit more art than science. But at some point, pushing towards the perfectionism range, there is a point where your effort is not going to produce substantial results, right? Like at some point, you're going to be spending a lot of time on things that don't really matter.
Yeah.
And on the opposite end, if you're just doing a shitty job, like there's a certain point where
Right.
putting in more effort will definitely improve the results in a meaningful way. And I think, at least for me, that's the most useful way I've found to think about it, is sort of how much impact is my effort going to have on the final product? Because there was a time in my life where I spent tons and tons of time trying to perfect things and tune them up and make them perfect. Like this sort of podcast is a good example where I would never want to do something like this in the past when I was creating content, because I wanted every single piece to be controlled. And I wasn't able to do things consistently or naturally because I was so focused on how can I make this perfect. And it wasn't until I let some of that go and saw better results from sort of this, like, it's like an 80-20 type of thing, right? Where it's like, if I can get most of it done, but every single detail isn't perfect, and people seem to be responding to it better, then great. That's probably a better pocket for me to be in. But there is definitely some work that I had to do to sort of shift myself down away from the perfectionist end of the thing.
Yeah, I can relate to that a lot. I've had a similar experience. I think we've talked about this in another episode too, of content creation, of how, it would take me like 60 shots to record like a 2-minute video because I wanted like every single word, because I wanted to do it from memory. I didn't want to like read it off anything. I wanted to give the right hand motions. I wanted to have the right eye contact. I wanted like everything like perfect. And that took me like 4 hours to do 2 minutes. And I was like, I cannot this is not this is not a worthwhile investment of time because I don't even know if anyone will notice. And yes, so I think that has been the learning process for me as well.
I think on the creative side of things in
Mhm.
particular, at least in the way that I've experienced it too, is I have had quite a few times where I spent a ton of time on something
Yeah.
that I thought was making the product or item, I don't know, whatever it was, better, only to find out that that people didn't care about the core thing. So another part of it is if you can find a easier way to sort of validate the thing that you've started working on is
Mhm.
actually a thing that people want, if that's the type of project you're working on, can really help a lot, right? So, for sort of a work slash school type example, like there were times in the past where I would just go ahead and write out this big thing, spend a ton of time trying to really tune up the details, make everything
Mhm.
perfect, only to find out that the core of what I was working on wasn't even really where it should be. Same thing
Right.
with creative projects. Like I spent a ton of time just trying to polish everything out and make it perfect.
Mhm.
And for what it was high quality, but it wasn't necessarily the correct thing.
Yeah.
So finding ways that you can sort of make the cycle shorter and not have these big, like, okay, I have to turn in this thing that is 100% perfect,
Mhm.
is also a way that I've found to really reduce perfectionism, because it's much easier to say, okay, here's this piece, or here's this outline or this shell or whatever else, and then
Mhm.
have someone go, oh yeah, okay, like maybe tune up this and this, and then as you get closer and closer to the end, really work out the fine details,
Yeah.
then to try to do that from the beginning and just hope that it's all exactly what it should be.
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me a lot of when I've created online courses and the first course that I did, I mean, I did build it as I went, but I know like some people who might want to like I want to build out my whole course or I want to write my whole book out before I get any feedback at all if this is actually resonating with the people that I want it to. And so you just spend all this time and effort and not like really even realize if it's something that they want or resonate with, and that could be a big waste of time. But at the same time, the way I did it, I mean, with other courses I was a little more relaxed about it, but still it was very stressful, and that I was just creating content as I go because I was like each week I'd like work with something new, but I'd have to like take in last feedback and like tweak it and adjust it and make it something that would resonate and be more productive or helpful for people.
Yeah, and I think you've mentioned a couple ways to sort of do this, and
Yeah.
there are a bunch of other ways to do it too, right? Like
Mhm.
there are a bunch of different paths towards sort of like putting out feelers and sort of like
Mhm.
starting to shape things in the direction that you want. And whatever particular path works for you that helps you get sort of the feedback you need to get on target for what you're trying to create
Right.
is going to be the one that's fruitful. And
Mhm.
this applies even to those things that are well, some of the things that are a little bit more
Mhm.
like towards school and stuff, right? Like if you're writing out an entire paper or an entire document or whatever else, just turning that in blindly without getting feedback from anyone else or just submitting it blindly, like is less likely, far less likely to be
Right.
perfect, whatever that means,
Mhm.
than if you are to involve other people in the process and sort of get things tuned up as you go.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Another thing I think it's important to kind of recognize, I was just a thought that popped up into my head was that it is important to recognize. I could see that it can be influenced by external factors, like let's say you have a boss that like you think you're turning in really great quality work, but this boss is always like micromanaging and like wanting like you draw out more or whatever it might be. And so that could maybe start the anxiety and kind of push your perfectionist tendencies even higher because the anxiety is higher because of like this micromanaging boss, that could create that anxiety even if it wasn't, if even if you weren't an anxious person to begin with. So I just wanted to point that out as a possibility.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think that happens a lot to kids, right? I think
Yeah.
a lot of kids get this
Parents.
pressure of their parents being like,
Mhm.
"Why'd you get a C?" as opposed to actually talking through sort of the process and the other pieces. It's just so focused on the outcome. And maybe this can open a piece of a discussion around not producing an environment that creates perfectionism in others and all the stress and anxiety that goes with it. But I think that's very, very common to just say, like, why'd you get a C? Why didn't you get an A? Which is not a very useful conversation, right? Like, it doesn't really talk about like ways to study better or sort of, the material and how they're like grappling with it and whatever else. And I think in the workplace, it can be the exact same sort of situation where if you have a boss that kind of sucks, instead of fostering growth and helping you develop skills that you need to sort of perform at the level they expect, they just ask or say, hey, you're not performing at the right level, so just start doing it. Which I think is slightly unfair, but so is life in general. And if you are the person on the receiving end of that, it's not necessarily a responsibility, but I guess it one of the only things you really have in your control is to sort of try to push back in the sense of saying, like, I would like to perform at these levels, at this level. What can I do? Can you help me find the steps? Can you help me find the gaps, identify pieces of feedback and whatever else? Because if someone has certain expectations of you but can't help you get to them, then it's just kind of a losing battle. I mean, obviously you're not going to get nice, tidy feedback every time you ask, but without it, it's very, very difficult to sort of move up to a set of expectations.
Yeah, you touched on a really good point in that we do have to communicate if we're wanting to get to a certain level, to express like what it is, like, hey, what do I need to do to get to that level, or ask for help, be willing to receive and ask for that help. And that might improve the situation, that might not, but I think it's important to communicate that. But also, one of the things that I want to add to like what you can do in those types of scenarios where maybe you have like a helicopter parent, or maybe you have a helicopter boss, or whatever the situation is, to also just be mindful of protecting your own mental health and well-being, because it's like, maybe it has nothing to do with you. Maybe they're dealing with their own shit in their own life and they're putting it out on you. So I just want to be mindful of that, and just kind of like, you have to do some maybe self-soothing, or find some support, whether it's a therapist or friends or whatever it might be, to kind of help remind you that, hey, I'm doing the best that I can. It's okay that it's not like perfect. I'm trying, I'm growing, and that's really what matters. Yeah. So yeah.
Assuming that you are doing the best that you can.
Right. Assuming that you are doing the best that you can. That's true. You do have to put in effort, but I know people that like, they work their asses off and they still feel like they can't do it right. And that's kind of how I felt a lot of the times as a kid. It's like, I didn't always get perfect A's, and that was kind of the expectation. And so I felt like shit, even though I was trying and studying and working my butt off. It just was like so disheartening when you're being like, well, you just need to do better. And it's like, I freaking study like into the hours of the evening, like, so it's maybe they don't fully know exactly what you're doing, or maybe you can just express that, like, I would study till like 4 a.m. during med school, but I realized I had to learn. I wish someone would tell me that it's not very productive because you're too tired and nothing's getting absorbed in your brain. It's actually more productive to get some sleep than to study till 4 a.m. But I was just so driven by the fear of failure and wanting to get it right, and working so hard. You have to take a like step back and realize it's like, oh, okay, I'm doing what I can. Maybe there's something I can tweak. Maybe I need to have like a coach or a mentor or something to kind of be a guide. But this doesn't mean that I can't become a doctor, or I can't achieve the thing that I want to achieve. It just means like, okay, there's a gap in my learning ability, and maybe I need some support somehow to help me close the gap on that learning curve.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you brought up, which is basically what you're doing, right? Like getting clear about what you're doing and the outcomes, and then sort of the options are really important. So like you're saying, like, okay, first of all, let's just assume you're actually trying hard, because I know in a lot of instances, talk to people, they're like, I'm doing my best. And then if they were to map out their actions, they would see that there's plenty of space to do more. But let's say that, okay, you're pushing it to the limit. Well, in that scenario, if you're not reaching sort of the goals or outcomes you want, then you have to look at the way you're trying to achieve those things. And like you were saying, you were studying for an exceptionally long amount of time, so long actually that it turned out to be the wrong thing. Like you were actually working
counterproductive
so hard that it was wrong.
Yeah.
And there was another sort of strategy or method you could use and eventually learn to use that produced better results. So, you know, if you are working at your maximum, the next thing to sort of look at is, well, is this work actually producing the sort of outcomes that I want? Because I've been guilty of this many times. I've seen it in others, where sort of this perfectionist idea, again, it's sort of this like effective use of time thing, where it's like you're pouring all this time into this thing that's not actually helping you achieve or create the thing that you want to in the way that you want. And I think that's where a lot of people get stuck, where they're just pouring all this time into a strategy that's not necessarily working, because either they think that that's what should work and it's not, or they haven't been able to come up with sort of an alternative path. But I think a lot of the time that is the place to really focus, to figure out what needs to change.
Yeah. And it helps to, you know, you don't have to struggle through it alone. You know, combine, whether it's like a study buddy or a mentor or tutor or a coach or whatever it is. It's just like find someone, because it expands your like brain capacity. Like that's how I was able to survive. If I try to like get through med school all on my own without my study groups, I would not be where I am right now. And so it took like a collective mind, because it's like they might realize and help you understand things better from their perspective. And so like combine like 5 perspectives, then it's like 5 more times the brain power of tackling an issue in a way. So, or help you see like, oh, what are they doing to, you know, they're passing their tests, they're doing way better. You know, what is it that they're doing different? And maybe it's just finding the right learning style that resonates. Or it's maybe, you know, for me, I learned that I can read like the same paragraph in a book 5 times and I will not remember. Like I need to like be able to explain it. Like a active learning versus passive learning is way more effective time wise, and just way more effective in me actually understanding and learning it. So it's just like, I have no idea what I'm talking about, but I'm going to attempt to do it, and it's going to look ugly and it's going to suck. But then I'll realize what I missed and what I need to fill in before the test or presentation or whatever that might be. And that helped me perform a lot better.
On a related note, in terms of talking to others, which I think is probably the best way to sort of make sure your strategy is on target.
Yeah.
Not only that, but for most tasks or things, other people have done them, right? So if you can find people who've already accomplished the thing that you're looking for, and multiple people, you know, 5-10 people, you can probably come up with quite a few strategies that have been effective for people in the past, and sort of mix and match off of their sort of strategies to find something that works for you. And then another piece on top of that is sort of, at least in my experience, a lot of times, like once you have those mix of strategies is when you are able to be more creative for yourself, right? When you only have sort of one thing you've ever heard of and you're trying that and it's not working and you're pushing really hard, I typically find that it's really hard to come up with any other paths. But when I've seen like 10, 15, 20 different ways of doing something or learning something or working on something, then I start to like be able to myself come up with paths that might be a little bit better for me. And then one other thing I wanted to add on was, as you're talking to people, if you can find people that have already done the thing that you want to do, it can help dissolve a lot of perfectionism, because if you ask about their journey, for most people, it is unlikely that they just showed up at the finish line. There are very, very few things that people can have enough natural talent in to be able to just sort of ride off of that into a sort of a position of success or happiness or whatever else it is that you're chasing down.
Totally, totally. And yeah, it's a learning process, and people might be at different stages. So it's like you can't necessarily compare yourself to someone who's been doing it for 5 years because they have more experience. Of course, they're gonna be better than you at whatever if you're brand new to something. But kind of just circling back around because I think I wanted to elaborate a little more, and I kind of want to pick your brain on this idea of going back to anxiety and the self-soothing, because I think like for me realizing, because yes, as a child it was drilled, Asian parents want you to get A's and it's just like that pressure to perform and perfect. I think what would have helped me in those moments where I was like, oh man, if I don't get those A's, then I suck and I'm a bad daughter and a bad child and all of that, was to just like, I wish I had the insight I had now to tell my 19-year-old self or early 20-year-old self to be like, hey, no, it's okay. You're learning, you're growing, you are worthy. This says you are lovable, you are enough. Like kind of those self-soothing, like soothing the little child that thinks she's like a fuck up, essentially. So yeah.
Yeah.
What are your
So
thoughts? Yeah.
I
I don't know if
had
I had a question. Yeah, go ahead.
my most recent and strongest experience, or my most recent experience was the strongest experience I've had in sort of breaking down perfectionism, which is I actually performed pretty well at almost everything I tried for a very, very long time up until I switched careers, which sounds really conceited, but it's true. Like I just sort of had this um,
You're good at
way
a
of
lot of
going about
things.
the world that it was just like, okay,
Mhm,
cool, whatever thing I
mhm.
apply myself to some degree, like I will probably perform pretty well.
Yeah.
And it took switching careers to like absolutely drop the floor out from under me.
Yeah.
And having built up such a long period of sort of like, oh, I'm going to perform fairly well at just about everything I do.
Mhm.
And don't get me wrong, I've done some work to like get rid of a little bit of perfectionism in terms of just like wasting a ton of time on things,
Yeah.
but not around like, oh, I'm actually not good at this relative to my peers.
Mhm.
Like from what I can remember, at least that is not something that I can remember, or at
Yeah.
least in a way that I couldn't just write it off and be like, yeah, of course I'm bad at badminton. I've never played badminton. Like,
Right.
um, but in sort of that process, it got me, I had heard like a bunch of times,
Mhm.
everybody's on their own path and you just have to figure it out and whatever else. But I never really felt it until
Mhm.
I switched careers and started seeing, people who had 10, 15 years of experience,
Mhm.
or even just, people coming out of school had 4 years of experience relative to my zero.
Yeah.
And I had to spend a lot of time sort of coming to terms with this idea of like, my value and worth has nothing to do with the path that I've chosen to walk.
Mhm.
And all of these things are sort of relative in the sense of, I've gotten to this place on my own path and this person went on their own path and they've just picked a different journey than me and they have different skills and struggles and whatever else, because it's also the first time that I ran into sort of people struggling with things that I felt that I was okay with at the same time
Mm.
as me struggling with something that, everyone around me was good at.
Yeah.
So I don't know that this is really a strategy or or useful or helpful at all, but that's what it took for me to really get grounded in a way that sort of erased a lot of this perfectionism, was just sort of really being immersed in an environment where I suffered for so long feeling like I was behind and whatever else,
Mhm.
until at some point my brain just allowed me to release that completely and fully accept like I'm just on my own path.
Right.
I might be the worst performer in this group of people and
Yeah.
it doesn't matter. Like nothing happens. I guess that's what ultimately broke it for me, is just
Mhm.
sort of seeing not being successful in the way that I had narrowly defined
Mhm.
didn't actually have any consequences. there was nothing extra negative that went on top of that. And, hypothetically, I could have done so poorly that I lost the job and I had to, find another one or whatever else. But realistically, in the day to day, all of the stress, all of the sort of anxiety, all of that was self-imposed. And even if somebody was saying like, oh, you're not performing up to this bar, you need to, step it up or whatever else, how much of that I internalized, which when I started was all of it, was still sort of up to me or on me in my control. And I was the one who was causing all the stress and anxiety for myself. So anyway, it's not really much of a strategy, but that's what it took for me to fully like sort of step into like this idea of things don't have to be perfect. You can just keep working hard and doing your best. And I think one of the things that helped me the most is recognizing the effort I put in did produce results. So it was slow and I was really far behind, but the effort, the genuine effort actually produced results. Whereas if I had just given up, which I had done in the past for other things, I would have made no progress.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that has been a really, I don't know if we are calling it a strategy, but I can relate to that story a lot, and kind of switching gears from career, but more to relationship in that, I had this like, in my teens and early 20s of like, oh yeah, I'll be a doctor by 27 or so. I'll get married. Start having kids in my early 30s. And it's just like my picture perfect life. And I remember because I ended a relationship of almost 4 years. And so it kind of set back everything. And I still like, I was on my perfect timeline that I had predicted for myself. And I remember being in Mexico, and I might have shared this story, I don't remember, with my brother when he was telling me he was about to propose to his girlfriend. And I cried. I was so upset. I wanted to be happy for him, but I had like just broken up with my long-term boyfriend like 6 months earlier. And so I felt like I was single and I was just like back to square one, it felt like. And I remember I cried. I felt terrible because it was like I'm ruining a special moment for him because I'm caught up in my own self-pity essentially. But I actually called one of my coaches and she helped coach me through it and remind me that, I'm exactly where I need to be right now. It's like, I don't want to marry that guy that wouldn't be able to give me the life that I want. That's not the path I would want. I wouldn't want to force myself into a situation that wasn't right. And my path is I needed to be single at that time. Yeah, maybe it delayed my perfect projected life, but ultimately I wouldn't trade it in for the world, and everything worked out for the best in my opinion, like reflectively looking back on my life. But yeah, it took me realizing that I'm exactly where I need to be right now. It's not exactly in the timeline that I wanted, and that's okay. I'm working towards it. I'm taking actions, and that's all I can do. And it could be slow, it could be painful, but it's part of the process.
Yeah, I think relating that back to sort of perfectionism explicitly, once you understand or really viscerally feel sort of something that is supposed to be perfect and like you've put so much effort into it and
Right.
either it just can't be or it's just not going to happen for whatever reason, I feel like from what I've seen, those sorts of experiences are the ones that can shake you out of it. And so I guess if you can earlier sort of get out of your head the idea that there are tight and narrow pathways that lead to good lives,
Yeah.
that will help a lot. Because I think that's part of it, is sort of going back to the school thing, getting this thing in your head of like, okay, I got to pass these tests so that I can get this thing, so that I can do this, and having this very sort of formulaic approach to life is not fruitful, especially when there are so many ways, so many different paths that people can take to lives that are still good, right? You can get C's, go to some random college, and still end up with a career that you really enjoy.
Absolutely. 100%. And
And
those
I think
people that get like, sorry to interrupt, but like the people that get like the straight A's in school, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're a perfect performer in their careers. There could be like people that like, a lot of it requires people skills too. That's not like something you're graded on in school. So that's something to factor in. It's like, hey, who looks at my GPA from like decades ago anyway. It's like nobody cares. Those tests that I stressed about, really in hindsight, it just really didn't matter. I'm not saying like, oh, just F everything and don't try, but I really didn't have to stress as hard as I did in hindsight, because nobody really cares about grades when you're like a grown adult living adult doing adult things essentially. Yeah.
yeah, there's there's so many paths. I
Yeah.
guess I just wish I knew that earlier, or was able
Mhm.
to feel it earlier, right? If
Totally.
I was able to just step more into that space of like, I'm changing careers, I'm about to get my ass kicked. Like, I
Right.
need to
Just
be okay
prepare.
with that.
Yes.
Yeah, if I could have found a way to step into that a little bit more
Mhm.
authentically beforehand. And maybe some of it is, you have expectations, you're not always going to meet them. Sometimes it hurts,
Yeah.
doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
And just sort of like letting those emotions run their course, and being
Mhm.
open to them, as opposed to really beating yourself up around, the perfectionist side of things of like,
Right.
oh, I should have done this correct.
Yeah.
There's something wrong with me because I didn't do this correct, as
Yeah.
opposed to sort of stepping into the process of like, I'm trying, I'm learning, didn't happen
Mhm.
this time. I still
Mhm.
have more space to sort of like grow and figure this out.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really great final point to make, of just like, notice when you're beating yourself up, and realize that it's not very productive. It's like, yeah, you could beat yourself up, but does it serve you at all? There's a little more helpful ways of perceiving it, and that, yeah, you're growing and you're learning, and it's all part of the process called life. So all right, well, I think that's we covered this topic pretty well. Any last thoughts?
Nope.
All right. Great. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in this week. We appreciate you. And if you appreciate us, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, share what you think about perfectionism, or if you struggle with it still, or you have in the past, and help spread the happiness in the world. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please take a second to subscribe, as it really helps out a lot. If you're looking for more content, there's all sorts of information over at howtohappy.com. And if you want something a little bit more condensed and concise, I've also written the book Mindscaping, which is essentially a framework for optimizing happiness. So we'll have the link there as well. And that's all I've got. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.